Thursday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're joined by Mike DeFabo, who broke the story about George Pickens being late for the Chiefs game. I want to talk to him about the George Pickens situation, how dire it is, whether the Steelers should or will trade George Pickens away, and what the Steelers can do differently about developing offensive leaders in that side of the team. All here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show in your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. You can use all the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNFL, to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. Go to Prize Picks today. We've got Mike DeFabo from The Athletic on back with us again. His internet's working great. He still hasn't put down his history, but we love having him on all the same. And Mike broke some big news. I talked about it briefly with Nick Farabaugh yesterday on the show. But, Mike, I wanted to give you the floor a bit to explain how the whole George Pickens being late to the Chiefs game became a thing, how you broke the story, and what the Steelers can make of a guy who was supposed to be the wide receiver one this year, both in play and in attitude.
Right. So, the reason why I wrote the story when I did is the story was 5 changes the Steelers should consider making. And one of the assertions I made was they should trade George Pickens. And the reason why I feel that way is go back to earlier this season. Mike Tomlin has continually stuck up for George Pickens. In some instances, it appears maybe he's lying for George Pickens, like when he says he didn't see his eye black and things of that nature. But it seems the coach is beginning to tire of his antics. And he came out in the Cincinnati game and said, George needs to grow up. And we all remember that big line. Well, how did George respond to his head coach publicly saying he needed to grow up? The very next game that he was active, he reported late against the Chiefs on Christmas Day. That was also the same game that he was accused of not running his route. He was also fined in that game for ripping his helmet off in frustration after jumping off sides. So for me, what this all points back to is you have a player that in some instances is not only your best offensive player, he's your only source of offense. And I want to make that very clear. I have nothing but respect for what George Pickens does on the football field.
Absolutely.
And I feel his upside is literally the Hall of Fame. I think that this guy is so unique and has so much potential. The trouble is, I don't know if he's ever going to achieve that potential. And what's going on now with the Steelers is they're approaching a crossroads. George Pickens is entering the 4th and final year of his rookie deal.
Mm-hmm.
It would be easy to say, let him play that out, see if you can get him on the right track, then make your decision. But George Pickens has something to say about this as well. Let's not forget that he basically got handed the playbook from Deontay Johnson. Ahead of the last year of your rookie deal, hold out, hold in, you're going to get an extension. So, we've seen it around the league right now where it's a booming wide receiver market, and more than ever, wide receivers are taking things into their own hands, and by holding in, forcing the teams to hand them guaranteed money earlier. Same exact thing happened with Brandon Ayuk. So before the Steelers reached that moment in training camp, I really do believe that the prudent approach would be you should trade him, get what you can out of this, and you have to remake the wide receiver room. As difficult as that is to say, and as hard as it is to punt on a player who has all this upside, I feel like there have just been so many instances of him having missteps that finally at some point you have to say enough is enough. And, we can't win with you. We can't win without you. And because our offense isn't as close as we need to, we have to make a dramatic decision and trade you.
And I think that's the toughest part for a lot of Steelers fans to swallow, because they're like, what do you mean? As soon as he went out for 3 weeks, the offense couldn't do nothing. And I
agree with them. Yeah,
and
I would agree.
And I think that might have been George's kind of like prerogative going into the Chiefs game, being like, they're fine. They know they need me to win, and they go in it. But I think to your point, what they needed from George wasn't just the playmaker on the field. It was the leader off the field who, would show up early. And then, it'd be one thing if that was Hines Ward crashing out at the end of the game, being like, what are we doing? But when you're the guy who's late, when you're the guy that's had to be talked about growing up in the same season, you were late to that very game, and you're the one crashing out at the end of the game, it creates mixed signals, and it creates problems that the Steelers, it just makes it tough for the Steelers to invest in a guy like that. And look at Deontay Johnson. We'll talk about the Steelers trend of diva wide receivers more in a bit, but that man's on his 4th team in a calendar year. So like, if there's anything that George Pickens he should have learned is like, hey, I need to shape things up. And let's also be clear, George has shaped up before. Like last year after the Colts game, he didn't block for Jaylen Warren. That was never a problem again that season. He played his heart out. He ran his routes. He played hard. That was fine. And the goal was, and the hope was for the Steelers, that would last into this year. And then he would prove it in his contract year. You could sign him to wide receiver 1 money. And then, okay, now you have your playmaker locked in. You've rooted out all the tough things that George Pickens has been going through. But now you're in a position, like you're saying, this is an offense that is trying to find talent at wide receiver. They looked at possible trades. None of them really worked out the way they wanted to. They brought in Mike Williams. They've drafted Roman Wilson, who didn't play. Calvin Austin stepped up a little bit this year. But now they have major questions at wide receiver on top of their major questions at quarterback, on top of their major questions at offensive line. And that's just, there's so much to account for. And so when you have to retool that much, maybe trying to use George Pickens while you have leverage right now to get another piece to help fix that another part of that in some way, maybe that's part of the answer if you don't want to sign him long term.
Right. And let me be clear here. It's not like I'm saying, oh, he was late one time and because of that, you've got to trade the guy. Right. Number one, this decision is coming to a head. Your choices are either pay him big guaranteed money or get what you can out of him now. Those are the 2 doors that you can open. And then the other factor here is this is a pattern of behavior. There have been repeated things. And sometimes to stick up for George, I will defend him here for a second. I do feel like as the media, people are kind of looking at George and waiting for him to slip
up. He is a target.
And he is under the microscope. And some of it's fair and some of it is unfair. I will stick up for George and acknowledge that. And I don't think that he's a bad person. I just think that he has some maturity issues and sometimes he steps out of line or he doesn't conduct himself as a professional. And my biggest complaint is, think of how much time and emotional energy goes into just making this guy play football, right? On that game, the Steelers had to dedicate a PR staffer just to make sure that he was on the field and got to the stadium. But then even the following game, the Steelers season finale, he's arguing with fans and Pat Freiermuth is holding him back. Now, during that situation, when your offense is struggling, you guys should be watching iPad together and looking at film and stuff like that. You should be dissecting the defense. You should be figuring out what you're going to do tactically and schematically to improve. Instead, you're worried about babysitting a player. And that's just where I feel like it's counterproductive to the team. And, other instances where Russell Wilson has to sit there with him and give him a talking to, and like Russ should be talking to him about, on this specific play, here's what I want you to do differently, not trying to keep his head in the game for you. And that's where I just feel like the Steelers have a pattern of going after these kinds of players. They see the talent. But sometimes it's just like, it could be something that festers within a team and creates frustration and creates, dysfunction. And I think that's where the Steelers are at offensively.
I think it's something they have to consider. And so that's why, I talked about it with Nick. I talked about it with you. I do think that if you can't figure out a way to get George to be that person that's not causing those problems and not being part of that, not being part of the problem, but being part of the solution, then you do need to find a way to make that work in your favor. And trading needs to be something that's on the table. I'm not saying that they will trade him, but I do think it's a real question, and a lot more of a real question than it ever has been in his 3 years with the Steelers. But I want to talk to you about maybe a trend that we could look at here, because we brought up Deontay Johnson. Both of those guys were in the same room last year, and now we're talking about them in the same way. And we can also point to other recent receivers. And is this a problem the Steelers have developed for themselves? Is this a problem that's just in the NFL? We'll discuss that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Mike DeFabo of The Athletic. Stick with us. We still got a lot to discuss when it comes to wide receivers, offense, and so much more. But first, remind you, this show is also brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the number one sportsbook in America. The NFL the playoffs are better than ever with FanDuel because they are America's number one sportsbook. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and you'll get $300 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's right, $300 in bonus bets for just betting $5. FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, and so much more. With the wild card round over, here are your divisional week lines in the NFL playoffs. The Chiefs are 8.5-point favorites over the Texans, Lions 9.5-point favorites over the Commanders, Eagles 6.5-point favorites over the Rams, and Ravens 1.5-point favorites over the Bills. Where will you put your money? Be sure to do so with FanDuel Sportsbook, the number one sportsbook in America. And remember, you can start the season with $300 in bonus bets if you hit your first bet of $5 or more only on FanDuel.com. Again, that's $300 in bonus bets if you make your first bet of $5 or more and you win on FanDuel.com. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Mike DeFabo of The Athletic. Mike, let's talk about maybe sort of a trend on the Steelers. And this is bigger than just this year. This has been a thing the Steelers have dealt with for a few years now. You could talk about George Pickens right now. You look at Deontay Johnson. They traded him to the Panthers. A lot of people didn't understand that at first. Then he went to the Panthers, didn't do well with their young quarterback, was traded to the Ravens, barely saw the field with them, got cut. Was reportedly beefing with John Harbaugh, and now most recently has been cut yet again by the Texans, who signed him after he was cut by the Ravens, and he was reportedly seen being upset in the locker room after they won a playoff game over the Chargers, complaining about his lack of being involved in the passing game. And so now he's been on 4 teams in a calendar year. That is an NFL achievement. The other guys have done it, but you don't want to be on that list because that's never a good sign when you are. And so you go back to him. You like Chase Claypool, who the Steelers drafted, started off red hot and then had to get traded away. They were fortunate to get that trade off and get a second-round pick for him. I don't put Juju in that category. I feel like he did some silly things, but Juju at least brought it, and you didn't have to trade him away. He just kind of his knee injury limited him at the end of the season. But you look at those guys, and then Antonio Brown's, I think, is a whole different case because you had him for 9 years. But there is a trend there that now you've seen with recent Steelers receivers that they want to fix, because the Steelers used to be the hub. That was the place wide receivers go to be great. Like, people used to say, I remember Ravens fans joking, like, we can draft a receiver in the first round. The Steelers will get some guy named Boo Boo Blanket, and then he just becomes an all-pro guy. And the Steelers haven't been that for a few years now, Mike.
Yeah, well, first of all, I always agreed with them that, like, the Steelers had this great track record of drafting guys in the middle rounds, and those guys would turn into stars. And for a long time, I believed, and maybe it's still true, that it was just talent evaluation. Mike Tomlin's a former wide receiver himself. It seemed like maybe they had the right formula of figuring it out. Part of me now believes maybe it was just Ben Roethlisberger. And maybe if you have a Hall of Fame quarterback, he elevates everybody. And if you get a guy in the third round, he's going to look, pretty damn good because he's got a Hall of Fame quarterback throwing him the football. But there does seem to be a trend here, Chris, and you have to ask yourself, are they attracted to these guys and they feel like guys with character concerns that slip in the draft, they can get the most out of them? And I do give Mike Tomlin credit because I feel in a lot of instances, I think he does a good job of keeping guys like this on the rails or getting the most out of them, because it seems like he got the most out of Antonio Brown. He got the most out of Deontay Johnson. Maybe he's getting the most out of George Pickens. The flip side of that coin, Chris, is sometimes I wonder, Mike Tomlin likes to say, I treat everybody fairly, but I don't treat everybody equally. And I wonder sometimes if that attitude might create a situation where guys feel like they're above the team. And they feel like, if I'm good enough, I don't have to abide by these rules. I don't have to show up on time because I'm the best player on the offense. And I think that has to go by the wayside, because, if you're treating guys differently, then you're not treating the guys who are doing the right thing fairly either, right? You're not treating Zach Frazier fairly if he's abiding by one set of rules and George Pickens abides by another. You're not treating Pat Freiermuth fairly if he's doing the right things, or Calvin Austin or Scotty Miller. So there needs to be that approach needs to change. And I also think that it is a position where there's ego It is a position where you have to feel like when the ball's in the air, I'm the best player on this football field and I can go out and get it. And I think that there are a disproportionate number of players who, I don't know how to phrase this, like have some selfish characteristic traits or have selfish behaviors or sometimes immaturity issues at that position. But there are guys like Larry Fitzgerald who are great team first guys. There were guys like Hines Ward willing to block for teammates. So I think the pendulum needs to swing in a certain direction here with the Steelers. And when they go into this draft, and I think they should get a wide receiver within the first, second, rounds, very much consider those guys. Character has to be a chief consideration within that. And not only what are this guy's physical raw traits, what's his upside, but also what is he bringing to our offense as a whole? And can he be a guy that we're going to have a young offense and we're going to want to build around? And this guy we can point to and say, in 4 years, he's going to be elected team captain. He's going to be going out to midfield, representing the Pittsburgh Steelers for us.
I agree with you there. Also, I just want to point out in the middle of you talking right there, Deontay Johnson just got signed on waivers by the Ravens again. He's not going to be able to play in the It's comical. I had to contain myself. I wanted to laugh so hard. I was just like, of course.
How does it keep happening? Maybe he's just going to go backwards through every team. Now, next he's going to go to the Carolina Panthers. Then he goes back to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy. But something you brought up too is important too, because the Steelers have had a great track record. Mike Tomlin seemed to know what he wanted at wide receiver for many years. And let's also be clear, Mike Wallace was good in his own right. Emmanuel Sanders went to the Broncos and lit it up for them. He was great for them. Also, Antonio Brown, I think he showed he could go anywhere and still.
Antonio Brown nearly became the best receiver of all time if he would have stayed, composed. He was on pace to do so in terms of records and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so I think they know talent-wise what they want, because even the recent guys, Juju was a good route runner. He got his knee blew out, and then he became a different receiver. Chase Claypool's raw talents were very impressive. I mean, his rookie year looked really solid. He was just a little not too up there in the head. And then Deontay Johnson, by so many metrics, was one of the best route runners in football for multiple years as far as creating separation in his routes. George Pickens, maybe the best contested catch guy in the NFL. So clearly they know what the talents are, but I think it's become a point where maybe what was happening before was not just Ben, but other guys in the room like Pouncey, like DeCastro. Over the years, there was a tone set in the offense where it's like, hey, get behind. We're the leaders. You shut up. You get behind us. You learn what it takes to be a Steeler. And so then that made it easier for guys like Mike Wallace, like Emmanuel Sanders to fall in line, and even Antonio Brown, and be like, okay, Ben and those guys, they're the leaders. We'll make plays. But you don't have that right now. And I think that's what we're going to get to that leaders portion in a bit here. But I think that's where the Steelers have been able to kind of get away with getting guys that were more diva-like in their attitudes, in their approach to the game, and not have to worry about it because they have those guys. But now you don't have those guys, and you're trying to find those guys. We'll talk about how they can and maybe will find those guys in the near future. But I also think it's an important thing to acknowledge, as you're talking about, that is a trait for a lot of wide receivers. You go back to Terrell Owens, you go back to Randy Moss. Larry Fitzgerald is the exception. He's like one of the greatest wide receivers of all time, and you never saw him doing any of those types of antics. And I think it's just something that you have to account for. But the Steelers are in such a tough spot right now where, again, that's why it's not an easy question of should you trade George Pickens, because he's such a playmaker and you need guys like him in your team. And if you trade him away, there's no guarantee that who you bring in won't also be another person that you kind of have to handle, because look at Minnesota, where they were just 14. They have 14 wins this season. They looked awesome. Jordan Addison about a couple months ago was putting on Instagram free 3, and he was a heck of a receiver this year. And I covered Jordan Addison at Pitt. He's a heck of a player. He works so hard, but sometimes it's just the way that wide receivers are just wired. They get like this. And so I think it might not be a Steelers problem, but I do think it's an NFL trend that you have to be aware of and have to be prepared to handle. And I don't think the Steelers have done well at handling that the past few years.
Yeah, because this position group has skyrocketed. I mean, the salaries specifically. Yes. And so, if you are a wide receiver in the NFL, you're sitting there saying, what's the quarterback play around me? I don't have a great quarterback. I have Kenny Pickett throwing me the football. This is going to cost me millions upon millions of dollars because I'm not getting the football as much as I want. And the quarterback throwing it to me isn't as good as I wish he was. And so these frustrations, I'm sure they do bubble over for those reasons. So, I don't know. I don't know if there is a way that you go out and you try to find guys who are more high character at that position. And maybe you find guys who are outliers at that position. And I think there are some decent candidates. I mean, if nothing else, like I like the guy from Ohio State,
Ibuka.
Ibuka. Everything that I've read and watched about him, it looks like he's a very willing blocker. He kind of does everything very well. He would be right in the Steelers' range. Actually, a mock draft that came out for The Athletic, he was who this Dame Brugler projected the Steelers to pick. And I feel like that's very realistic, a guy like that. So, I think that they're going to have to make it's going to be fascinating to see what they do at that position, because other than quarterback, I would say that the whole George Pickens dynamic is the next biggest question on their roster because of his talent, because of what he's meant to this offense, and because, whether you like it or not, it's coming to a head because of his contract situation.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the leadership aspect of the Steelers here, because that's the other factor on top of just the talent part of the offense. They need a group to emerge there and a new nucleus there. We'll talk about that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Mike DeFabo, stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, this episode is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscription that you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals that you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features of the subscription tracker, I use it to cancel services I wasn't even using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. Plus, with their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon, rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Mike DeFabo of The Athletic. He's their great Steelers reporter. Mike, let's talk about this Steelers offensive leadership future of this team. And I've felt like this has been at the crux of their problem for a few years now, ever since Ben Roethlisberger retired. There was no standing voice who could say, I give everyone follow me. I have it like Cam Hayward. He carries the flag for the defense, as does TJ Watt, Minka Fitzpatrick. And then you even have lieutenants like Alex Highsmith, where I think like in another world, Alex Highsmith could be a leading voice for a team, but he doesn't even need to be because there's so many leaders in that defense right now. The offense doesn't have that right now, and they were hoping Russell Wilson could help reset that. I think that he's a good voice, but ultimately when you don't play at a high level, it's hard for you to also be a leader in that sense. The Steelers had it for years with Pouncey, DeCastro, Ben, and even AB, again, like he wasn't, the most sane person at times, but he would still set the tone with his work ethic. He would stay late after training camp practices and work with other guys. Like there was leadership down the board. They've been trying to find this for years in these good locker room guys. I think Najee Harris was one of those picks. They hoped that he could turn into a leader. They hope that Pat Freiermuth could turn into a leader. I think that they hoped Kenny Pickett and George Pickens could be part of that movement. Broderick Jones, another high pick that they made. Troy Fautanu, who didn't play this year. Zach Frazier, Roman Wilson. They've been making these young investments, trying to build this young nucleus, and maybe they will work out. Maybe there will be a core here. But Mike, I ask you, if you're looking at this group, who do you look at as the potential future leaders of this offense, or are those answers just not on the roster right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the trouble with this offense in some senses is that a young offense, that youth manifested itself in the form of immaturity. And I look at, I guess, Pat Freiermuth may be one of the top candidates to be a leader. Like this, it seems like when the Steelers gave him his money and he realized he was going to be part of their long-term future plans, he was already a guy who was pretty cooperative with the media and seemed to take a leadership role and try to speak and be like kind of a voice of the team. And it seemed like he really stepped up in that department even more as the season continued. And I even look at look, it's a little thing. It's just media availability. Let's be clear that talking to reporters is not the most important thing when it comes to leadership or quality of play, right? But I will say, when I covered the Penguins, when they would have a bad game, you know what you could count on? Sidney Crosby sitting at his locker knowing I've got to talk. It's my team. I am the captain here. And you see it on defense. Like Cam Hayward comes out and he wants to be the spokesperson for the team. And that's just publicly what we see. But I'm sure behind closed doors, he's also being the voice of this team. And so, I think Pat can be part of the solution. But they definitely need more leaders. And part of the problem is the quarterback position is so unique in sports. And not only is it the most important on-field position because he has the ball in his hands every time, and it's a passing quarterback-driven league, but guys look to that guy to be the leader, the sole leader. And so when you're having turnover at the most important position, there's also going to be a bit of a decline in the leadership as well.
Absolutely. I think that's part of what the Steelers need to figure out. I asked Mike Tomlin about the turnover question. He was like, that's not an excuse. And I'm like, I'm not looking for an excuse, buddy. I'm looking for what has been the biggest problem in developing that leadership voice. Pat Freiermuth could, like you say, be very well be one of those guys. I think that there's guys that need to learn how to become leaders. I think Hines Ward didn't step onto the field and just say, I am the guy. Everyone look at me. I'm going to lead this offense. He became that guy over the years. And I think that Pat Freiermuth could be one of those guys. But they need other guys to be like that too. I think that on this offensive line, they need some captains to emerge. Maybe Zach Frazier. Zach Frazier seems very soft-spoken. But the way that he played, he looks like it. I think Troy Fautanu is one of those guys.
I think Fautanu really, if he stands out, I think that he could end up being one of those guys because I don't know. You just get a sense about him when you talk with him that he's very level-headed, mature, composed. He carries himself in a really impressive way that I think is going to rub off on the rest of his teammates. And the other thing you could do, we've been talking about remaking the wide receiver room. I really like the idea of bringing a guy like DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, I think schematically he would fit a lot of what the Steelers want to do and stylistically. But then also, everyone always talks about what a great leader he is and what a great professional he is. And so, I think that you need some voices of leadership specifically in that wide receiver room. And I think that he would be a great candidate. You bring him in, you trade George, you draft a wide receiver first round. Now you've got Roman Wilson also in that room. You've also got Calvin Austin. To me, that seems like that's a pretty good core right there. And with DeAndre Hopkins being kind of like, that's your leader, that's the guy that you look to set the tone and kind of change the culture within a wide receiver room that I think has had some flaws there in that department.
Hey, look, Joe Hayden did that for the cornerbacks when the Steelers signed him. He was a big part of doing that. I think the Steelers could absolutely use a move along those lines that just kind of says, hey, you know what? We've been trying at this. And again, like you trade away George, you draft another young wide receiver, like you said, you'll have Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson. Hopkins could set a tone. I think also a Tee Higgins could set a tone.
Tee Higgins,
I think that he's another guy that fits that equation there. But that's where the Steelers, I think it benefits them that they have so much cap space already, and they'll probably get a lot more when they let go of Preston Smith and maybe others like Larry Ogunjobi. They can end up with like $70+ million in cap space. That's enough space to sign a guy like Tee Higgins and still make other necessary additions across the roster and figure things out. But this team needs to find something. They need to find something as far as leadership in the offensive side of the ball, both leadership in production and in attitude and in setting the tone for others to follow. I think that's a big key here. That's a big reason why George Pickens right now is someone that we think could be on the chopping block for the Steelers. If it comes to the trade season and they get the proper compensation back. But Mike, thank you as always for joining us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let people can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on all social media at Mike DeFabo, and always read my work in The Athletic.
Absolutely. He's Mike DeFabo. I'm Chris Carter, host of the Locked On Steelers podcast. You can find me on all social medias at Carter Critiques. You can read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com, including my recent film study on what truly was wrong with the Steelers' defensive game plan against the Ravens on the run and the pass. And as always, you can find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Friday episodes. We're back tomorrow with Jenna Harner, ending the week and getting us set up for a divisional round in the playoffs, all here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.